and you're watching ET Now.
Hello and a very warm welcome to ET Now's special program on the vote on account. This is part of a series that we'll be bringing to you in the run-up to the actual vote on account later this month on 17th February 2014. I'm Maithili Busnurmat, and over the next 30 minutes, we're going to be discussing the ins and outs of the vote on account with three very special guests. Pranab Sen, former member of the Planning Commission, Subir Gokaran, Head of Research at Brookings India and former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and S. Narayan, former Finance Secretary to the Government of India. But first, a few words on the vote on account. What is the vote on account? Is it simply what it says, a vote by Parliament on the accounts of the government of the day to enable it to carry on its day-to-day business till such time as a new government is in the saddle? Or is it really much more, a mini budget as it were? The forthcoming vote on account is a first for the present Finance Minister, but it's not a first for the country as a whole. We've had 13 votes on account to date, the most recent by Pranab Mukherjee, former Finance Minister and presently President of India, and earlier by Mr. Jaswant Singh, Finance Minister under the NDA regime. So what can we expect from PC's maiden vote on account? Some more of the magic? Some might call it spin that PC is famous for, or will it be a somber reading of the grave issues facing the country today? We'll know on the 17th. But before that, let's get in our three experts for their views on the vote on account. Let me start with you, Mr. Narayan. You've been Finance Secretary and also you were the Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister during the NDA regime. And you've done both the full budget as well as the vote on account. What really is the difference? Is a vote on account a much more relaxed affair? Does nobody take it seriously? How different are the two?
I think the important difference is the budget lays down the total receipts and expenditures for the government for the whole year, whereas an vote on account essentially is just to keep the government going until the government comes in with a total budget. If I may make the difference, in the vote on account you can't announce new projects. I mean, you can announce new projects, but you can't provide money for new projects. You can't really provide expenditures on I would say planned schemes which are not carryover schemes from the previous year. So which means that you can, as best, what you're saying is you're rolling on current year's expenditure for as long as the vote on account allows you to roll on. So this is the fundamental difference.
But if I can now turn to you, Professor Sen, and ask you, because that both Mr. Pranab Mukherjee as well as Mr. Jaswant Singh, when they presented their interim budgets, had announced increased expenditure on various items. They'd announced a whole host of new programs. So what really is the sanctity for these announcements? Can they just make them? Does anybody really take them seriously?
Of course. You know, this is the perfect opportunity to actually lay down what your economic agenda is for the next year, even though you can't actually implement it till the elections are over. But it's a great way of putting your manifesto on the block.
A vote on account, by definition, is purely a vote to continue the government's expenditure until. So if the government makes some speeches, I mean, everybody can make speeches in the Parliament while introducing any bill, but those speeches have no relevance as far as the budgetary process is concerned. We have to distinguish between the rhetoric, and I am not sure. I was there when Mr. Jaswant Singh gave that budget in 2004. I'm not really sure whether he laid down an economic agenda for the next year.
Both Yashwant Sinha, Mr. Jaswant Singh, as well as Pranab Mukherjee used the occasion of their interim budgets to hold forth on all that the government had done and all that the government would do if it were voted back to power. As Pranab said, it's a wonderful platform for the government to sell itself. But does anybody take any of this seriously, especially in a country where even election manifestos are not really taken seriously? What is your take on that?
When programs are provided resources, when money is made available, there's no guarantee that the department concerned or the ministry concerned will actually run with that money and actually implement the scheme. So, it is basically a process where the government declares an intent in a regular budget, but execution depends on a variety of factors, how other ministries react, the overall circumstances of the design of the project, the utility of it, the political significance. All of those factors matter. Now, in a last year budget, in the vote on account, it's essentially a farewell speech. In any farewell speech, the person demitting office is given an opportunity to reflect on his or her contributions, put them in a larger context, justify their actions. So I fully agree with Dr. Narayan's distinction between budgetary process and rhetoric. But we've all become very used to budgets essentially being both practical statements and rhetorical statements, and I think that's a culture, that's a convention which is quite useful to us.
Absolutely. But Pranav, if I could just point to something that Subir said, perhaps inadvertently, or maybe it was a slip of the tongue, he called it a farewell speech. So will it really be a farewell speech, or will it be a promise of this is what I want to do? If you remember, Pranab Mukherjee had said, oh well, if this is what we're going to do, if only you vote us back, or something to that effect. So what do you think? Will it be a farewell speech from Mr. Chidambaram?
That is in fact the sensible way to do it. I mean, a farewell speech accepts that you are not coming back. So if you're doing it properly, as I said, this is all rhetoric, because at the end of the day, the vote on account is strictly driven by what was passed in the budget in the current year. So this is pure rhetoric, and the rhetoric presumably would take advantage of the one occasion where the media across the board carries every single word.
Mr. Narayan, you talked about the vote on account being very different and how governments cannot pass any new laws, etc. But Mr. Chidambaram is recently on record, and I quote, he says, we can make any proposal short of amending any law. We can also outline a vision for the future. So indirect taxes, we've already seen the government announce a few changes. What is there to prevent the government from announcing some more indirect tax changes?
No, indirect tax changes, as you are aware, that is customs and excise duty changes, can be brought about by notification. In fact, even 2 days back they changed the tariff rate for gold and silver. So this is a continuous ongoing process. There's no kind of a big deal in making customs and excise notifications. And if you really think about the Income Tax Act, the Income Tax Act changes comes about from the next financial year. So in a way, whatever is announced actually comes into effect from the next assessment year, and which means that it also is a change in legislation which has then to be passed by Parliament. And therefore the Parliament in this vote on account cannot consider a finance bill in its totality, which includes changes which require legislative changes, which is what Mr. Chidambaram is saying, that nobody can stop me making changes which are purely executive in nature, whether I do it. Normally when Parliament is in session, you do not even make executive changes without putting it before Parliament or announcing it in Parliament in the first instance. If the Parliament is not in session, customs duty changes he can just notify and table it before Parliament on the first day. So this is what he is actually saying, and he's perfectly correct in saying that.
Subir, even if the finance minister does tweak the indirect tax rates a little bit, is there any credibility at all to the numbers that he presents for the next financial year? Because normally what does one focus on? Everybody focuses on that one number, the fiscal deficit target, as a ratio of the GDP. So agreed, most people assume, particularly after the spectrum auctions that we've seen, that he will succeed in achieving that 4.8% target. But even if he projects that next year he's going to do something very magical and get the fiscal deficit down to 4%, will anybody believe that? What would you, as a former central banker, be looking at?
I don't think we have any basis to work on if there is a projection for the deficit, that is the revenue receipts and the other receipts and expenditures. Those only have legitimacy when a duly elected government, whoever constitutes it, actually goes through a budget process. So at best, the indications of what might be if the same configuration were to come back to power. But even then, an election is a game changer. It is a disruptor. So you cannot expect even statements that are made in a closing speech. If you don't like the word farewell, I'll say closing. the new parliament, the new government, there may be a different finance minister, who knows, even in the same configuration. So, this is really a reflection. I think that's the best way to look at it. It's a reflection on the last 1 year as a matter of formality. So the deficit number estimate for the current year, for 13-14, is an issue. Did the government meet the target? And as we're now seeing, perhaps there's not much fear that it will not. But also it's an opportunity to reflect on the 5 years, because there is an economic story there. Some people will paint it very negatively. Some people will paint it, somewhat positively. So I think that story, this is an opportunity to tell that story as a basis for re-election, or however you want to see it. But the future, what is being said about 14-15, whether on taxes or on deficits or on policies, are all purely speculative. They have no predictive power. They have no basis on which anybody can make any commitment. So effectively, we're in fiscal limbo between now and July, or whenever the next government presents its budget, whether it's the same configuration or somebody else.
That means we're going to live in a fiscal limbo, and you're right, we have lived with this kind of limbo in the past. But given the kind of grave juncture at which we are, with our GDP growth for the second year most probably at sub 5%, the global uncertainty all around, Pranab, can we live with this kind of fiscal limbo, or should we kind of ensure that governments are really, can we hold them accountable, and can we say that yes, you cannot really make bizarre projections, there has to be some amount of sanctity to your numbers? How can we really do that? Can we really make governments more responsible as far as numbers, even for the future, are concerned, even if it is a vote on account only?
Well, let's be very clear. I think Mr. Narayan will back me up on this. The background work for even the vote on account is as meticulous as it is for a regular budget. So the numbers that are going to be projected are not going to be any more fictional than they were when a regular budget was presented earlier. The second issue is that insofar as projections are concerned, what Subir has said is absolutely right, that since you cannot present what are going to be your new tax initiatives, you cannot present what would be your new expenditure heads, it's very difficult to make a projection about what your fiscal position would be. But about the current year, certainly. Number two, remember, a vote on account actually is going to take up 4 months of the next year. And a lot depends upon the lame duck government, or whatever you wish to call it, how much of the expenditure that is permitted by the vote on account is actually made. Remember that we are going to probably see a sharp reduction in the plan expenditure in the current year from what was budgeted. The point is that in the vote on account, they can actually go back to what was budgeted and take 1/3 of that as for the next 4 months. Question is, will they do it? That is where the issue of responsibility comes up.
Mr. Narayan, if I can turn to you right now, what can we do to make the government act a little responsibly? Are there any institutional mechanisms in place? Because if you remember the FRBM, the Fiscal Responsibility and the Budget Management Bill, we had an act passed in Parliament, but the Finance Minister, Mr. Chidambaram himself, first pressed the pause button, then he suspended it, then we had the Kelkar Committee giving us a new roadmap. So what is there to really hold governments to that roadmap? Not just this government, but future governments also. Is there any way we can make them fiscally more accountable, more prudent, and more, what shall I say, honest as far as the people of the country are concerned?
I think that's a lot of questions to answer, but let me take a few of them. I totally agree with the professor that the kind of numbers, the kind of work that is done towards a budget is a very, very detailed work. So the numbers of the current year would be very factual numbers. Let's come to your question from a slightly different point of view. Let's take this year. The finance minister is going to achieve the fiscal target, and therefore he is going to abide by what he said in the FRBM modified. Where he said he'll give a pause, and then he has said he'll go to 5.3, 4.8. He's going to achieve that. But the worry is different. The worry is that 4.8 will be achieved through, let us say, spectrum sales, through disinvestments, through dividend payouts, etc., and also through expenditure compression, and non-performance on the plan side. And this is where the question of responsibility comes in. So in a way, even though 31st March 2014 may look very nice in balance sheet numbers, starting on 1st April, there's a lot of liabilities, particularly unpaid subsidy bills, unpaid petroleum subsidies, etc., which are going to mount up. So to that extent, there is irresponsibility. On the day of the budget, certainly he is going to find room, because he would have come much below the 4.8 number, much room for some additional expenditure. So quite possibly he would have 5,000-10,000 crores of money to announce something, which would be like a giveaway, before the election. But again, if you ask the question of responsibility, this is casting a burden on a new government, which perhaps would be very difficult for them to continue. So you're going to, I think at the end of May, June, July, when the new government presents the budget, the hangover of all these, I would say, unpaid bills, the unmet capital needs, as well as I would say the unspent planned funds, are going to be a burden on them. So to that extent, I would say certainly the responsibility is inadequate.
Pranab, would you say that in the case of a vote on account, there is the possibility of some kind of adverse selection, in the sense that the government of the day can announce very populist measures, and in fact even before the vote on account, very often in fact they preempt it. They announce some populist measures and they don't budget for it. With a little bit of financial jugglery, they postpone it perhaps hypothetically to the next year. So what is there to prevent governments from saying, after me the deluge? Can we really think in terms of putting some institutional mechanism in place? The FRBM didn't work. Can we have something in the Constitution which says maybe even 6 months, not just after the model code of conduct, but 6 months before, 9 months before, government cannot announce certain populist measures? Would that be correct, or would that go against the very grain of democracy?
No, I mean, the fact is that the system is in place. The vote on account essentially says that thou shalt replicate what you have done over the past year, over the next 4 months, or whatever is the duration of the vote on account. So in a sense, what the parliament has voted in is continued without modification, except to the extent that Mr. Narayan pointed out, which is things like indirect taxes. So the point is that any announcement about giveaways, about expenditures, about tax cuts, whatever, all of those are merely promises being made by the finance minister in the event that this government comes back. So, and I think that's perfectly legitimate. But the fact is the next 4 months will not be any more or any less responsible than the past 1 year. So the real call is what happened during the past 1 year, and does it make sense for that to continue over the next 4 months, or will we be okay with it? And my sense of it is, yes, I think we will be okay with it.
Okay, but I wanted to ask Subir this question over here, that the government, there's nothing to prevent the government really from booking expenses on paper, but actually not putting it through the accounts and holding it forward for the next year. So the next government has to really live with it. What can we do? If you remember, of course, this sounds like a catastrophic event, but the Greek government, the new Greek government, when it came to power, discovered that the numbers were completely, not correct at all, way off the mark. So this is, hopefully we've never had that situation in India and we never will. But can one really ensure that the numbers that we get in the budget are the correct numbers as they really are?
Well, I think the most significant check and balance on this is the outgoing government's expectation that it will come back to power. So, you're talking about a scorched earth kind of approach, which is, no hope of us ever getting back into power. So let's do whatever we can, go out with a bang, and let the next guy take, pay the price. But that's not the way it works here. Every government, as you yourself said, goes into an election with some expectation that it will come back to power. And when it does that, there is an inconsistency between what you're suggesting and the situation that it expects to deal with when it comes back into office. So I think there's a self-preservation element to it. It says that don't screw up the situation such that if we have to deal with it, we are stuck. And I think this is a disciplining force which has served us very well, and really reflects, I think, the sort of strength of the rule-based system, the constitutional system, if you will, which has this built-in incentive that no government will ever be tempted to muck things up so that the next one has a really difficult time dealing with it. Perhaps in Greece it was a matter of desperation. There wasn't any sort of political vision there. It was just a matter of dealing with a situation which just got out of hand. I don't think we're in that situation, at least fiscally, right now.
I hope not.
So I'm not to me the scenario you describe is not a very likely one.
Yeah, of course it is. I was just painting a very gloomy scenario to get a response from all of you. But we're coming to the end of this program. But before we close, I'd like to take a quick comment from all three of you. Mr. Narayan, do you think the best check really on irresponsibility is the prospect that you may get voted back to power and have to live with what you do?
I think the best check on irresponsibility is a strong democracy. I don't think a government can come up and announce very irresponsible programs which can never be implemented, and then hope that they will not be found fault with, either by the public or by the opposition. And there is also, for irresponsible expenditure, let us not forget that RBI is also a watchdog, and RBI continuously monitors not only central government expenditure but state government expenditure and continuously reports on it. And therefore, there is always a check and balance between what the government throws away and what the RBI comes back and says that this is not what you should be doing. So I don't think that irresponsible behavior is a kind of a word that we should use in the democracy, and certainly we should not use with Parliament.
Okay, I would agree with you certainly. But Subir, how good a watchdog is the Reserve Bank of India? A quick comment from you before we close.
Well, there were hawks, doves, owls, and now they're dogs. So you'll be running the entire sort of flora and fauna gamut here. But as Dr. Narayan says, I don't think it's a matter of RBI specifically. I think there is a basic constitutional system structure in place which does basically prevent the kind of behavior they're describing. If it's not the RBI, it's all of you, it's all of us constantly commenting, observing, criticizing behavior by government, actions by government which we perceive not to be in the larger public interest. And it's not a risk that anybody wants to take, because as I said, ultimately there is nobody in this game who is playing it with either no desire or no expectation of winning. So that to me is the ultimate incentive, the alignment of incentives. And I have therefore very little concern that we ever end up in a situation where a vote on account becomes a grandstanding, a sort of just a last glorious action going down in flames. It cannot happen.
Okay. Pranab, would you agree with that? Can we have a last word from you before we wrap up this discussion?
Yeah. Maithili, one of the, I think, the best indications of how responsible the government is what the government has done on the supplementaries. Now, you would have noticed that Mr. Chidambaram has been extremely tight on any supplementary demand for grants, so that at a time when he could actually have exerted a huge amount of populism, he actually chose not to. And that really should allay any apprehensions about adventurism over the next few months.
Well, absolutely. I think he's had a very tough time. He may have had to walk alone, not only with the RBI governor, but also with his cabinet colleagues. But on that note, we'll come to the end of this program. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Dr. Narayan, Professor Pranab Sen, as well as Subir Kulkarni. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you.